I think it's Amazon ambassador.
Yeah, exactly. Becomes the ambassador.
Yeah. Okay. Very good afternoon. Bom dia for anyone joining us from Brazil or time zones on the other side of the Atlantic. And welcome to the fourth in our series of IDS Brazil and the World seminars. My name is Alex Shankland. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute of Development Studies and in the Power and Popular Politics cluster, and I convene the IDS Brazil initiative. And I'm really delighted to have today with us in person two very, very expert speakers on the theme of Brazil's domestic and global engagements with the fight against hunger, with a particular emphasis on global dimensions in the field of South-South cooperation and in the field of Brazil's leadership of the G20. To my left, we have Lydia Cabral, who is co-cluster leader of our Rural Futures Research Cluster here at IDS, founding member of the Food Equity Center, and also of the IDS Brazil Initiative, and plays a key role in some of our strategic partnerships with Brazilian research and policy institutions in the field of food systems. And we have Laís Gus, who is a visiting fellow and previously a visiting doctoral student here with us, who is doing her PhD on Brazilian cooperation and its decision-making practices, specific focus on interrelationships among Brazilian institutions linked to the South-South cooperation programs of the Brazilian government, particularly in the agricultural field. So her research interests are in Brazilian foreign policy analysis, international development cooperation, South-South cooperation, and teaching methodologies. So, Laís, wonderful to have had you with us as visiting fellow, and thanks very much for agreeing to be one of our speakers here. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Melissa Pomeroy, founding co-director of Articulação Sul, one of Brazil's leading centers for research and policy engagement on South-South cooperation and international development, and member of CONSEA, Brazil's National Council on Food and Nutritional Security, has come down with dengue fever. And unfortunately, dengue is one of several scourges currently affecting Brazil. And the other, of course, as you may have seen in the news, is the really disastrous flooding that's hit the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul. And our thoughts and our solidarity are with Gaúchos and other Brazilians caught up in the disastrous climatic events in the south of the country. But this is a really important moment to be discussing these issues because, in addition to Brazil's long-standing trajectory as a source of innovation, inspiration, and action in the field of the fight against hunger globally, which Laís will be talking about through the lens of South-South cooperation, Brazil is, of course, holding the presidency for this year's G20. We here at IDS would be very engaged with the Brazilian G20, and particularly the T20, which is the academic track of the G20 presidency, which is led by SEBRE, by FUNAG, and by IPEA, our partners from Brazil. So we've been delighted to have the opportunity to represent the UK on the International Advisory Council through our Director Peter Taylor's membership of the IAC. And also to be invited to convene events at the Brazilian Embassy. So watch this space. There is an upcoming event at the Brazilian Embassy in London on the field of the G20 agenda and the struggle against hunger and poverty, which will be on the 20th of June at the Brazilian Embassy in London. We are also engaged in several of the task forces of the G20, of the T20. Our colleague Caroline Kenne from the Digital and Technology Cluster here at IDS is co-convening the Digital Inclusion Task Force, Task Force 5. Several of us are writing policy briefs, and Lydia is co-convening Task Force 1 on the fight against hunger, poverty, and inequality. So she's extremely well placed to speak about the role of the fight against hunger and poverty in the G20 agenda. So can we get the PowerPoint up, Gary? I just want to run through briefly what we're going to cover in today's presentation. And the idea is that because we're down one speaker, Lydia and Lais should have about 20 minutes each to speak. And then we'll have hopefully 20 minutes for an initial round of discussion. But then those of you who are able to stay either online or in person in the room are very welcome to stay for another 30 minutes after that. So we're going to start off with a very brief reflection on why it is that Brazil has taken the lead in this agenda. Lais is then going to give us a brief history, a brief history of 5 decades of Brazilian South-South cooperation, really helping us to understand the principles and processes that underlie Brazil's role as a key provider of South-South cooperation. And then she will outline some of the current challenges and contestations that the Brazilian engagement with international development cooperation through the modality of South-South cooperation is facing. And then hand over to Lydia, who will bring us right up to speed with Lula's return to the presidency and the G20 agenda. And then I will briefly share some reflections from a document that Melissa sent. So Melissa, who, as I say, because she's unwell, is unable to join us from Brazil, but she's shared with us the latest document from Conselho, from the National Food and Security Policy Council. And so I'll briefly share some key points from that, which hopefully will provide a good starting point for the discussion. Okay, so Lais, over to you.
Yeah. Next. Where is the pointer?
You've got the pointer. Yes.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Well, first of all, thank you for coming, and thank you, Alex and Lydia, for having me here at IDS and here today. And well, as Alex said, my name is Lais. I am currently a PhD researcher at Brazil, but here I am a visiting fellow, and I've been working with Brazilian South-South cooperation in agriculture and food security since around 2012. But here today, my challenge is to present you with this overview of South-South cooperation in general. So I'm going to begin with some of the traits, some of the characteristics of this the South-South cooperation of Brazil. So first of all, you all know that Brazil is a developing country. So we are going to see here some common principles, or at least at a discursive point, as a discursive principle and traits of Brazilian South-South cooperation. Brazil shares with this kind of wave of the emerging or re-emerging donors that are not emerging anymore. We don't know. And the first of it is horizontality. And this is exposed by the fact that Brazil uses not the term aid, foreign aid or assistance, but South-South cooperation or development South-South cooperation, as we can use as well. And Brazil also uses the term partner instead of donor and recipient. So those terms express this important principle that is at the bottom of South-South cooperation discourse, that is horizontality. And the second principle is that what triggers Brazilian South-South cooperation is demand. So Brazilian cooperation is also demand-driven. So these demands, they arrive to Brazil via Brazilian embassies in developing country mostly, but also via visitors that come to Brazil, or when Lula or other presidents visits other countries. So from these demands, Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs usually transfers these demands to the Brazilian Cooperation Agency, or ABC in Portuguese. And the ABC looks for partnerships with usually national public institutions or other institutions, national institutions that are capable of helping to build some projects or initiatives that can tackle the problem or the demand that the country presents to Brazil. And also we have below 3 other principles, 2 that are common with this discourse of South-South cooperation against the bad characteristics or some characteristics that are very criticizable of the North-South cooperation, that are non-conditionality in terms of products or services that the other country must contract with the donor or the partner, and but also it's a very controversial principle because it's non-conditionality also in terms of democracy, for example. And the other principle is no interference or no intervention in the domestic affairs of other countries, which is very known for everybody. And the last one is the use of structural projects. So Brazil, at the beginning of its South-South cooperation in the 70s, 80s, and until the beginning of the 2000s, used to use some initiatives that were isolated, but we're going to see through all the history of this consolidation of South-South cooperation at the beginning of the 2000s that mostly ABC and other national institutions understood that these isolated actions were not so effective than structural projects or projects that are tackling more than one challenge in a broader way when they're building these projects. So about some partnerships that Brazil has developed throughout this process of building its South-South cooperation that are important to develop these projects. The first and the main important is with the UNDP. Since Brazilian legislation doesn't allow the country to transfer resources abroad, Brazil has developed this partnership with UNDP. So to transfer resources for the South-South cooperation projects, Brazil first has a broad agreement with UNDP and transfer these resources to UNDP, and then UNDP transfers these resources to the projects and to pay the diaries and the tickets for everybody that is working on these projects. So there is this arrangement that is a little different from what we are used to see with North-South cooperation. And this was, as we are going to see, one of the challenges of Brazilian cooperation, but also a factor of more stability for the Brazilian cooperation, because these agreements with UNDP are for 4 years. So if we have an agreement for 4 years and we plan these projects for 4 years, this budget for 4 years, the Brazilian government is has a less maneuver space to cut or to raise this budget as well. So the main partners, we can call it partners or recipients of Brazilian cooperation, are Latin American and Caribbean countries. When we talk about agriculture and food security, we can see many projects with Bolivia, El Salvador, and in the Caribbean, Haiti, of course, because of the role that Brazil had at MINUSTAH. And in Africa, we have mainly Portuguese-speaking countries, but throughout the 2000s, also Brazil has developed a diversification of these partners, going beyond the Portuguese-speaking countries and targeting also other countries in other regions of Africa. And in terms of trilateral cooperation, we have mainly Japan, that is a big leader at trilateral cooperation, Germany, France, Canada, the UN agencies in general, and when we talk about agriculture and food and nutritional security, we talk mainly about FAO and PMA, and multilateral banks as well.
Can I just intervene? Sorry.
Yes.
Where are the BRICS in this picture?
Well, we don't have BRICS as a main recipient, even like when you talk about partnership with South Africa, for example, in Africa, it's like, yeah, it's like a little awkward maybe that we don't have in trilateral cooperation, for example, we could have here India and Africa, but we don't have.
Right?
Sorry?
IBSA fund.
Yeah, IBSA, yes. IBSA, it's like the biggest initiative when we talk about this kind of partnership for development cooperation. But with development cooperation, South-South cooperation in general, in terms of this kind of technical cooperation and humanitarian that are the main modalities of Brazilian cooperation, we don't see BRICS as like a group very much. Well, going to this part of the modalities, the main modalities of Brazilian cooperation. I'm sorry that this is in Portuguese, but because I got it from the last COBRAD report, that is our main report that IPEA and ABC build times to times. I'm not gonna say each year because it's a report that is very unstable, but we are still trying to consolidate this kind of report in Brazil. But this is the report of 2019 and 2020, so the last data that we have, like through government channels, of the budget that the federal government had with international cooperation per modality. So the main one are the contributions to the international organizations that you can see are far beyond the other modalities. But we have humanitarian cooperation and technical cooperation above, and scientific and technological cooperation, and far below the others, educational cooperation as the main modalities of Brazilian cooperation. This is a panorama that, in this case, is the data are for 2019 and 2020, but we can see this throughout the other years from 2000s to now. So here, to see clearer, we take the contributions to international organizations of this panorama, we have almost 50-50% to humanitarian cooperation and technical cooperation, and below that, scientific and education. These also are data from 2019 and 2020. Oh, sorry. Here another panorama that is about the areas of cooperation. So here we can see the importance, or how valuable is the agriculture in cooperation broadly in Brazil. So these are the values that were used by sector also 2019 and 2020. These values are in thousands of reais, that are currency, they're not in dollars, but we can see, like, the most important part is that agriculture is far beyond the others, like more than double, almost triple in 2019, and triple in 2020, and more than triple in 2019. We have social development after education, environment, works and job, health, public administration, management of technical cooperation. So it's an important, this is a challenge, like it's one important part of the budget is going to the management of the technical cooperation, public security, planning, and defense. So now going to a more historical context of Brazilian cooperation as a developing country. As you know, Brazil was integrated to the aid system first as a recipient, and since the beginning was looking for like the speeches and the documents of Brazilian cooperation as a recipient showed that Brazil was trying to figure out how it could contribute with by itself with the projects. So in the 70s, we have the first actions of Brazilian cooperation as a donor or as a partner that shares knowledge and shares technologies. And this was due to the influence mostly of the South-South cooperation movement led by Bandung and other conferences. But in the 80s, we had the so-called lost decade in South America and in Latin America, including Brazil. So we had this demobilization, not just of Brazilian South-South cooperation, but of South-South cooperation in general. But despite of this mobilization, we saw also the creation of the Brazilian Cooperation Agency, the ABC, in 1987. But it's important to notice that Brazilian Cooperation Agency are not just, its mandate is not just to deliver Brazilian cooperation, but also as a recipient. So it was important from the point of view also of Brazilian managing the received cooperation and not just the things or the knowledge that Brazil shares with the world. Let me just press here. So some years later, in 1995, Brazil was appointed by the UN South-South Cooperation Committee as a pivotal country. So this was important. Brazil was not very fond of it. Brazil was not very happy with this pointing, but it raised the demand of for Brazilian experiences, Brazilian development initiatives and Brazilian policies, and consequently raised the involvement of Brazil in Africa, Latin America, and also international organizations. And these haven't happened just because of this title that Brazil received, but also in the context of the redemocratization of Brazil. So in this time, Brazil was raising as a global player, and it was the desire of Brazil be seen as a very big democratic country that could lead like the developing world. And finally, we arrive at the golden age of Brazilian South-South cooperation, where South-South cooperation was a priority for the government, which was during Lula's first 2 terms from 2003 to 2010. So the South-South cooperation and this role that Brazil has in the developing world had a lot of different motivations and factors that contributed to it. So the first was assuming this leadership role in Latin America and also as developing country in a more broad sense. The second was the legitimization of domestic policies, because Lula was seen as a very radical leader, as a communist, and in Latin America, you know, this is not very well seen. So Lula and his government need some legitimization from abroad. So having the policies approved and validated internationally was a means of legitimize the government's decisions. Also, we had what we call the paradigm of the logistic state, which is a foreign policy paradigm when the state acts as a proxy for its companies. So the government was leading its own companies throughout the world. So a very good example was that when Lula, Lula still travels a lot, but at that time he was traveling a lot, and he carried with him a lot of not just ministries and deputies, but also he carried a lot of business people with him throughout Africa and Latin America and other countries. Well, we can't forget about security motivations, especially in the borders. We have a very big region of frontiers, so Amazon especially, and the Atlantic border. The fifth motivation was the characteristic and the identity of the Workers' Party, the party in the government, as was a workers' party. So the heritage of Karl Marx is like it's a party that has transnational bonds. So it was very important for this spirit of international solidarity. And last but not least, the international context of the rising powers and South-South cooperation in general as something important and complementary. Sorry, guys. Well, so at this time we had a peak of ABC's budget. We had the creation of CGFOME, the General Coordination of Humanitarian Cooperation and Fight against Hunger, that took care of the humanitarian and fight against hunger, mostly separated from ABC. So it was one institution especially for this. We had also collaboration and confrontation of social actors as important actors, being part of the government, helping to advise and bridge with other social actors from abroad. So we had this important role of transnational networks between peasants and right-based movements that helped in this big movement of South-South Brazilian cooperation, especially in agriculture and food and nutrition security, and the role especially of Brazilian Food and Nutrition Council that Alex has already mentioned, the CONSEA. With being this multi-stakeholder place to build advising to the government and also projects. With Dilma, we had the successor of Lula. She was his colleague, and they had the same party. So we had a continuity of these ideas and this discourse, but a more emphasis on trilateral arrangements. And we had also the beginning of a big economical and political crisis. So we had the impeachment in 2016, and from 2016 to, it's wrong there, it's 2018, we had Temer government, it was like a tampon government, and after that, Bolsonaro. When the discourse changes a lot, so we had like South-South cooperation as the discourse was anti-South-South cooperation and anti-partnerships with developing countries, because what were we doing with these countries that have nothing to offer? So it was a very critical moment for South-South cooperation. CGFOME was closed, so we have humanitarian cooperation under ABC again, and in terms of monitoring, mainly during Bolsonaro, we looked for an OECD model to monitor, so Cobradi reports are closer to the TOST model of OECD. And here I just but the number of the new South-South cooperation initiatives for us to see that in Lula da Silva we had a very big number of new initiatives in an annual average, and in Jair Bolsonaro we have just 15 annually. So this is important. And to finish, I am going beyond my time. We have the challenges and the controversies of this cooperation. So the first one is that there are many national groups that are against aid or against South-South cooperation. They say that we have our own problems at home, so why we are spending our money abroad? The second challenge are the critics about the development model transferred. And here, these social groups are very important, mainly because we have like very big contradictions inside Brazil in terms of agriculture. For example, we have people that are hunger. We have these controversies with peasants and family farmers and agribusiness. So which kind of model we can transfer to other countries? The three challenge is the lack of a big strategy of South-South cooperation that can lead to the misuse of the money and, well, this kind of challenge of the effectiveness that we all have, and to finish the institutional challenges because we don't have legislation that supports this kind of spend of resources. And also during Bolsonaro government, we had like Bolsonaro government shut it down some important ministries and also CGFOME that were very important in terms of fighting against hunger and poverty. So now we need to rebuild these ministries, and the challenges that were big also in terms of coordination and cooperation are even bigger because we need to rebuild these bonds. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lais. So Lais has given us a really good introduction to the trajectory which took us up to this moment of crisis and now potential rebirth. And Lydia is going to bring us right up to date. Do you want to use this?
No, I can press it.
Okay.
Right. So
Got your mic?
how much time do I have? Well,
You have
just
17
show me
minutes.
your hand.
17 minutes. I'll show you how many you got 2 minutes.
Okay. Right. So good afternoon, everyone. I will, when I'm ready, get started. And I wanted to bring you, first of all, three brief observations in relation specifically to how hunger and food security are reflected in some of the Brazil's South-South and South-South cooperation and international engagements through the modalities that Lais has been talking about. So the food security and hunger agenda have been quite central to the Lula's government in the first period, and there was some continuity during Dilma's period, as Lais talked about in general, but that applies also to the food security and hunger agenda. I have a number of examples I could give you, but perhaps just in the interest of time, just to mention a couple of things. SDGs, zero hunger, so familiar to all of us today. That directly borrows from Brazil's zero hunger program, Fome Zero, and Brazil's delegation played a strong role in the framing of the SDGs. And then also in the international field, through experiences with bilateral and trilateral cooperation programs of the sorts that Lais described, Brazil has been able to influence the language, propose particular modalities of cooperation for food security, and the homegrown school meals are a strong example of that. A holistic approach to feeding children, ensuring children go to school, while supporting local smallholder farmers, and connecting them to local markets through school meals. So this holistic approach has been a mark of Brazil's policy approach to addressing food security, with a very sort of broad understanding of what food insecurity means. And that has been taken to the international stage. And now if you look at the FAO, WFP web pages and search about their interventions in the food security domain, you see things that are very much influenced by the Brazilian experience. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second one is that Brazil's international engagements drew on domestic experience. I've just said that, but domestic actors, governmental and non-governmental, use that international exposure to strengthen their own domestic struggles. So they have increasingly, and through South-South cooperation and trilateral cooperation, expanded their networks, publicized their own experiences, and through that process strengthened their own capacity of mobilization, but became more prominent in domestic sphere. So the international engagement for domestic actors is very important to strengthen their struggles above at home, in addition to cooperation and exchange and so on. During Bolsonaro government, however, because at home the conditions were not very welcoming to people working on food security, social protection, and so on, a lot of them went abroad, and there's examples of the diaspora of Brazilian food security experts and social protection experts migrating to Rome, working at the UN Rome-based organizations, but also choosing to take a few years off, doing PhDs, including here at IDS. We have received at least one. So there was this process of, during a moment where the domestic context was very hostile, some of these epistemic communities, if you want to call them, were moved abroad and used that also to consolidate their knowledge, to strengthen their skills, and so on. And talking to Melissa the other day, as we were preparing for this event before she fell ill, she said also that this hibernation period, I think she called it that, was important for those who stayed in Brazil, including working at the Brazilian Cooperation Agency. She put it as a moment of reflection and consolidation of knowledge. So, there was not much funding available. The government was not very favorable to cooperation with other southern countries, but they seem to be busy thinking and perhaps consolidating reflecting about what their experience has been in preparation for succession. Okay, my third point is that now, as Brazil returns, Lula has been saying it over and over again, the government is trying to, in a way, pick it from where it left it. In the food security domain. So trying to rebuild what was dismantled in the meantime. Bolsonaro got rid of, cut funding to several programs that were important for international cooperation for food security. Also, closed down Conselho, that you've heard about several times, an important policy space where government and civil society come together to talk about food security and nutrition. So a lot of things were closed down, dismantled, and so on. So when Lula takes over, it's about reestablishing these spaces, recreating these spaces, and going back to 2015 and continuing where things were left, but also with new initiatives, global initiatives, as I'll talk about. And this is a particular point in time to talk again about food security and Brazil's role, because things in the meantime had really got to the worst. The food insecurity has increased in Brazil. The graph that you see there on the left, the blue line shows, not very usefully, shows food security. So food security has declined since 2018, particularly to present, and food insecurity has risen. The latest data actually shows further increases. So hunger, Brazilians like to say this, Brazil is back to the hunger map, está de volta ao mapa da fome, Brazil. So hunger is again a concern, food insecurity is a concern. COVID-19 and insufficient priority to address food insecurity has led to these circumstances. So Lula is very much motivated to putting hunger and food insecurity at the top of the agenda. That was the thing he said in his victory speech when he was elected. He's been insisting that in several spaces, that food insecurity, fighting hunger is his priority at home. Internationally, Brazil is presiding the G20 this year, with a summit coming up at the end of the year in November. And one of three priorities that the Brazilian government has set up is addressing hunger, fighting hunger, and promoting social inclusion. And an important thing that the Brazilian government wants to leave behind is this new global alliance against hunger and poverty that it's at the moment being constructed with the G20 countries, and it's going to be launched this year. And of course, Brazil is hosting COP next year, so all eyes on the climate front. The food security agenda is not featuring so much there, and that's a problem, but that's a space to watch. So now, so I've said that, I want to discuss three questions. They are a bit leading questions, apologies for that, but I want to discuss whether Brazilian government internationally is punching above its weight, where it's overlooking changes to domestic and global contexts, and whether the global alliance that is being announced will make any difference. So on the first point, so I mentioned Lula's commitment to addressing hunger, and this is of course welcome. But going back to where things stood 5 years ago is not enough, because Brazil looks very different from compared to those days. To start with, there's lack of domestic resources to fund some of the policies that made Brazil Lula so popular on the social protection and food security fund. The funds are simply not there to take them back to those levels and increase them to respond to increasing needs as reflected in the previous graph. So Brazil is turning abroad for alternatives. Although they claim and have the legitimacy in terms of the know-how, because they've done some of these policies themselves quite successfully, they need support from abroad to fund the programs. However, one problem that Brazil is facing, the Brazilian government apparatus, and I guess civil society to some extent, is that capacity is a bit of a problem. As I said before, domestic institutions have been paralyzed or dismantled, so rebuilding will take time. It's taking time. Perhaps it's taking too long. Some social movements are already complaining that I don't see enough being delivered. Things are too slow because rebuilding is going to take a bit of time, and Brazilian government, Lula, cannot afford that, because there's half of Brazil desperate to get rid of him and his government. And also, another problem that Brazil faces, so in the international front, is that international coalitions and alliances are looking much more complex than they were before. The BRICS has expanded to further 5 additional countries, making it even more heterogeneous. There's all sorts of internal infighting within the BRICS, but also the G20 related to trade, related to territorial disputes, alliances in the context of the 2 big conflicts that everyone is talking about. So this is a bit of a problem. And The Economist has put it recently that Lula wants Brazil to be all things to all people. A friend of the West and a leader of the global South, a defender of the environment and a global exporter, and so on. And this is starting to be a bit of a problem, because you can't please everyone. The second question is whether Brazilian government is overlooking changes to context. So I said it already, rebuilding is not enough. New ideas are needed to deal with new challenges. COVID-19, for example, exposed intersecting vulnerabilities and inequalities that are at the root of food insecurity. So we know that food insecurity has racial and geographical sort of configurations. So new tools are needed. It's not just going back to the same old tools. We need new tools to address food insecurity as we now understand it. And of course, there's the climate agenda. Climate action needs to be linked to food system inequalities and inequities at their root. And Lula will quickly lose support from social movements if it disproportionately favors in the climate agenda agribusinesses in accessing funding for transitioning to more sustainable regenerative practices. These are linked to food security. We can't separate, though. They're being treated in separate spaces, but social movements are very much aware and trying to be in the climate space as well. So Lula needs to be aware of this, the sensitivities around climate and how it impacts the agri-food sector. And finally, so I want to say a few words about, if I still have time, very quickly then, whether the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty will be a game changer. So just to say that, you know, the creation of this space is, of course, very important. The G20 is a powerful, very powerful bloc, and 2/3 of the world population, you know, a lot of attention there. But this is not new. There's a G7 alliance for food security, so that there are multiple other spaces discussing food security. And the danger is, and I think you'll probably make that point in a minute, is that the proliferation of spaces to talk about food insecurity and hunger will end up weakening weakening the debate and weakening particularly multilateralism, which is so dear to Brazil. But there is, however, an opportunity for Southern leadership in the food front. So Brazil, India, South Africa, all heavily involved in the G20 process. India hosted the G20 last year. South Africa will be the host next year. They all have the right to food in their constitutions. They're all shown strong commitment to addressing food insecurity. So they want to show leadership in this front, and they're well positioned to hear that. There's also an opportunity, I think this will be my last point in the interest of time. There's an opportunity for Southern leadership to offer an opportunity to diversify the direction of knowledge, the direction in which knowledge circulates internationally around solutions to address food insecurity, including from south to north. For example, the UK is, we know, food banks rising, lots of people in food insecurity and facing hunger, lots of discussions around promoting access to affordable, dignified food. But will the UK turn to Brazil, India, and China for inspiration? I don't know. I think I will leave it there because I think you want to make some of the points that I want also to make in the next slide. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, I think we've given us a really excellent starting point for the conversation. But I did, as I mentioned, we're not able to have Melissa with us, but I thought that because Conseil is such an important institution, and Laís has highlighted this, Lydia's highlighted this, I thought it was important to bring in some of these key points from yesterday's document. This is the latest statement from Conseil on the Global Alliance and Food Nutritional Security. And I think it's very important to contextualize this, understanding what it means to have a National Council on Food Nutritional Security with such a strong civil society presence. I think people may be familiar with the kind of Brazilian model of deliberative or participatory policymaking, and the idea that there should be joint commissions, committees, or councils of civil society actors, government actors, deliberating on public policy. This is well established in the literature. We've studied it here at IDS, in the health sector and others. Conseil is remarkable. It's if you like, perhaps the most significant example of that since the early reforms of the 1990s. It's directly linked to the Brazilian presidency. It is an advisory organ of the presidency of Brazil. It has the power to sign off on or not national food and nutritional security policy decisions. It has heavyweight representation from across multi-sector representation across the ministries and very significant civil society participation, including the social movements who are raising some of these challenges that Laís and Lydia have spoken to. And this reflects the process through which Brazil's own domestic policy innovations in food and nutritional security were created. They were co-created in a tense, complex, contested process of bargaining between social movements and the state. They didn't just spring out of nowhere. They were not invented in a technocrat's office. They were created in very vibrant and as I say, contested dialogue between civil society actors and state actors. And Conseil represents the institutionalization of this dynamic that produced a globally influential wave of innovation. But as Lydia has said, there is a question as to whether that innovation is being maintained. Right? We're talking about 10 plus years ago, right? In fact, Zero Hunger was launched 21 years ago, right? So Conseil has been reconstituted. As Laís and Lydia pointed out, it was abolished in the Bolsonaro government. It's been reconstituted, and it has an advisory role in Brazil's global strategy for the struggle against food, nutritional insecurity. So it's well, that's Lydia's time up, not mine. But I'm actually going to take just a couple of minutes. The questions raised by the statement that Conseil just released actually do speak to a lot of the dilemmas that Lace and Lydia have highlighted. For example, this question about space proliferation, right? As Lydia highlighted, CFS, Committee on World Food Security, regarded as a model in many ways. In fact, its civil society mechanism mirrors Conseil at a global level. And the first point they make is, are we looking to bypass the CFS, or are we looking to strengthen the CFS by launching this mechanism for the Global Alliance? More broadly, will the model leave civil society on the sidelines, or will it bring in civil society as an integral part of the creation of initiatives to tackle hunger globally? Will it simply reproduce colonial patterns? So we have G7, we have lots of examples of northern government-led, corporate-heavy, top-down anti-hunger initiatives. And the question is, will this be yet another of those, or will it actually challenge colonial relations and model a different way, inspired in some of the South-South cooperation principles that Lace highlighted, right? The statement also highlights the debt crisis. Most of the countries struggling with chronic hunger are also struggling with very severe issues around indebtedness and the lack of a sustainable pathway out of debt now. Is this going to be part of the financing model? Is debt relief going to be part of the finance, or swaps or other modalities going to be part of the financing model? More broadly, are we talking about the human right to adequate food as enshrined in various UN agreements, or are we talking about market-based solutions of the kind that have been touted in many other fora? And will the process of implementing it be one that prioritizes a consolidation of corporate power in agri-food systems, or a reimagining of those systems on a more sustainable and just pathway, which again Lydia's highlighted? So I thought it was important to bring this in. I wish we could have Melissa with us, both to speak to it and to answer any questions you have. But anyway, that's the document she shared from Conseil, and I'd like to take the remaining 5 minutes or so to, well, first of all, ask you to thank the speakers with a round of applause, and then we'll go around for a round of questions as well. Thank you. So I think we have just the one microphone, but we'll do 2 or 3 questions in a round. So and some questions online as well. Great, Gary. Okay, we'll do an in the room and then we'll go online. Thank you. Questions in the room? One, okay, Lydia, John. Okay, start with this, two.
Thanks a lot, and great set of presentations as well. I was wondering if you could speak a little about, so within the Global Alliance around hunger and poverty, what prompted poverty to be added in this Brazil-led initiative? Was it the increase in poverty during the pandemic or something else? And in that discourse led by or convened by Brazil, are the populations affected and policy responses to addressing both treated as one and the same in Brazilian discourse, or is there some nuance in terms of those responses?
Thanks, John.
Yeah, so many questions, so little time. First one is this reconstituting of these institutional arrangements now under Lula 3, and wondering about the Ministry of Agrarian Development and its role in this agenda, because Alex, you were talking about civil society organizations, groups like MSP and others that have been very active on issues around land reform and agrarian change, as well as the food security agenda. And wondering how that features in that thinking about trilateral arrangements, South-South cooperation. Is that part of the discourse, part of the agenda, or is it much more about the agro-technical side and exporting the Brazilian technology and knowledge and so on? It's more about agribusiness, small and large. That's one. The other thing is in that list that you were showing, Melissa's, about the CFS. I was wondering about the role of the CFS and the connecting up to that. I didn't quite follow that first question. So what's the thinking about kind of circumventing the CFS?
Thanks. Yeah, Peter.
Thanks, really interesting. And just, I guess, John's question inspired me as well to think. One of the things that we saw emerging out of the COVID-19 pandemic globally is a lack of trust in institutions. Generally, citizens, communities really don't believe very strongly that state and other apparatus, which collectivizes efforts, really is serving their best interests, or even is going to be able to function. And obviously, in the Brazilian context, you've had massive swings of, you could see your history, thanks, fascinating. And obviously Bolsonaro was an extreme end of the swing, but you've also just said, Lydia, even with Lula, there's oscillation already taking place because people don't know how is this going to pan out. So if there's that low level of trust, and then there's perhaps a recognition that things may not be consistent, to what extent do citizens really believe that these initiatives and efforts led by the state are actually going to deliver on anything? And does that then remove the opportunity for state innovation to mobilize people and to support needs if the trust is very limited? Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Well, some great questions. So you have, what, 30 minutes each to Lays, do you want to respond first? You got that?
Yes.
And then let's say something in response to the question about the conseil.
Very diverse inputs as well. So first, I would like to remember that the document that Alex is commenting was released yesterday, so it's like really, really fresh. And well, first, hunger and poverty. I don't know if I understood it correctly, but if they're like being addressed together in Brazil as well as in the G20. Yes, like Brazil had this major dark government during Bolsonaro area, and not just because of the government, but also because of the COVID pandemic and the way that we tackled these problems during these like 4 or 5 years. Like it was there are major problems, both hunger and poverty. First, in the two first Lula terms, hunger was the major problem that was being tackled, but every time, like together with poverty, because of the ideology of not just the party but Lula itself. So yes, I feel that they are being tackled together. We had two big programs and two big policies in the first Lula governments that were both against hunger and poverty. The first one was Bolsa Familia, the family purse that was of the distribution of resources, and the second was Zero Hunger. They were like walking together side by side. So I feel like that. I don't know if Lydia has another opinion about the reconstitution of the institutions and this duality about agrotechnology, agribusiness, and agrarian development during during Lula first two terms. They walk also side by side, and this is the biggest contradiction of South-South cooperation against hunger and against about like agriculture, because we have developed through the 70s onwards big arsenal of agribusiness technologies. So we are a very very good or very big leader in this scenario, but we are also a very good leader, and we have transnational bonds and networks of peasantry movements, and also family farmers, where we have family farmers in Brazil that are both in agribusiness and are both into peasantry. So it's this duality that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges for South-South cooperation in this area. And we see that the Agrarian Development Ministry and the Social Development Ministry were big stars back there, but so was Embrapa. So it's like a big challenge, because we can't like take off these actors as well. About CFS, I'm gonna pass over to Lydia. And about the trust in institutions, I'm going just to give you an example about these floodings in Brazil that are happening right now. One of the biggest problems that people are spreading fake news about the decisions that the governments, not just the federal one, but also into municipalities and the state governments are taking. So this is a very big challenge for the trust into institutions. And one of the main examples is that mostly people don't want to donate to public funds. They prefer to donate to private a person that I know that's going to buy like diapers or water. So yeah, it's a major challenge, I think, in terms of mobilization and the use of resources of the government.
Thanks, Lydia.
Okay. just to add a few things to Lai's responses. So on Vidya's point, I think MDS, so the Ministry of Social Development's strong involvement in setting up the Global Alliance is a big reason for why these connections are being made. So they are one of two. It's the Social Development Ministry together with the Foreign Affairs Ministry that are leading a task force that was established to create and launch the initiative, which is great because they have programs like the school meals that have those connections that I mentioned before. So it's great, but it's a bit of a problem in the absence of other important areas. And for us who work in agriculture, I think the absence of the Ministry of Agrarian Development is a concern because there's an opportunity here to connect with rural poverty, connect with fairness and equity in relation to food production as well as the distribution of that food. So the absence of that part of government is something that has been raised actually by Conseil. I was chatting to Melissa last week, and she said that. So, but this is an area that we don't see enough progress. I think the important connection that is being drawn between hunger and poverty is there partly because of the Ministry of Social Development's influence, and that's good because it brings useful experience. It would also appeal to the Chinese delegations in this because what I heard in Berlin just these last couple of days is that China is very much wanting to put poverty and the fight addressing poverty as one of its main international cooperation areas. So there'll be a lot of interest in making that connection with food security. Now, I wanted to go back to the Ministry of Agrarian Development. That is absent so far in this conversation. I think it will be brought in because I see signs that will happen. But to say that also that because they've been shut down, it's just at the moment they're in a mode of in a responsive mode, trying to catch up, and I think the absence that we're seeing in some of the spaces are a reflection of that. But it is a little bit of a problem because development cooperation is starting to be reestablished. There's several actors, including those more linked to agribusiness, the more corporate agricultural players that are catching up very quickly, that are, there's spaces where they are debating, very influential with Brazilian diplomacy. So I fear that South-South cooperation will pick up and trilateral cooperation just with a partial set of experiences from Brazil's agriculture and food systems. And take the UK example, the UK government, perhaps the current government, things might change, but is interested in cooperating with Brazil to take a particular type of technology to Africa, very interested in climate smart agriculture, in integrated agricultural, livestock and farm and forests, which is a quite problematic piece of technology in Brazil. It benefits the better off. It is very problematic in its approach to what forestry means, for example. So it is a set of experiences that are quickly occupying the field, and that's a problem. And just a final thing that I wanted to say in relation to Peter's point. I would say it's less. The problem is less what citizens. Brazilian society is at the moment, very fragmented. I don't think trust in government has ever been very high. also a reflection of the sort of coalitions that you have that, governments respond to a huge diversity of pressures, and they're always contradictory because of that, including in the agricultural sector. But the problem is how Lula's government will be able to manage its relation with civil society and social movements that were so eager to have him back. And I think they're very happy that Bolsonaro is gone. But this is a delicate balance, I think, for civil society actors, including those involved in CONSEA, showing support, because if you don't show support, you're kind of supporting the alternative, and the alternative is awful. But at the same time, just being very aware that, in this coalition government where, Big Ag has a huge influence, this is very problematic. And I think that shows very clearly, perhaps less in the poverty and food security debate where, the sort of actors involved are all in agreement with each other. But if you look at the agricultural sector, these are huge tensions there. It's very difficult for the MST, the Landless People's Movement, for example, to accept certain things and to accept the fact that the Ministry of Large Agriculture, the Ministry of Agriculture, and not the Ministry of Smallholder Agriculture, gets the bulk of public funding, and that's the reality. So this creates a very difficult space for civil society and social movements to know exactly how to interact with government support, but being critical as well. And I think CONSEA, with this sort of statement, is showing that how they're trying to manage that delicate balance.
Brilliant, thank you, Lays and Lydia. Just a quick comment. So the question about the CFS, this is a paraphrase of what the statement says, which is in Portuguese. But basically, they say, we acknowledge that the president of the CFS has been invited to be part of the steering committee for the Global Alliance. However, we don't think that substitutes for a strategic guideline of participation as a core principle of the Alliance, institutionalizing formal engagement strategies along the lines of the CFS civil society mechanism, which demonstrates how important it is to incorporate movement and voices from the peripheries, from people of color, indigenous people, traditional people. So they're essentially saying, look, it's not enough to put one person on a steering committee. We actually need an organic, institutionalized, regularized engagement with diverse constituencies, including the marginalized. So I think that's the argument. So sidelining the CFS means, if you like, tokenistic inclusion of the CFS institutionally, but not taking on board its way of working with social movements, particularly of marginalized groups. I think that was it. Very briefly on Peter's point about trust and social energy, I think Lydia's answered it very well, but I want to highlight that where this came from in Brazil was not a strategy from the state to society, it was the other way round. So Herbert de Souza Betinho and the hunger campaign of the 90s is absolutely foundational for understanding how zero hunger became a hegemonic discourse in Brazil, which it really was not before that. So you have a civil society essentially coming from the Catholic left, right, which shared a lot of key actors with the Workers' Party, but was not the same. So it was not a party-based campaign. It was a civil society campaign that made hunger unacceptable in the vision of the mainstream media and the Brazilian middle class, which had never been the case. So famously, Brazil was already one of the world's largest food exporters in the 1990s. It had 32 million people going hungry every day. And for that to become unacceptable was a strong process of, like Gramscian hegemony, right, of building a social consensus. And the challenge Lula has, he's trying to build it from the top down. And he's a brilliant speechmaker and a brilliant articulator. But ultimately, if you don't have that groundswell, and the social movements represented in CONSEA have also been struggling with lessening of their organic ties with civil society more broadly, which is just a general process of change that's been happening in Brazilian society. So I think restoring that level of trust also means finding a discourse that can articulate different components of Brazilian society, including, for instance, the evangelical Christian movement, which is very, very influential in the among the peri-urban poor in Brazil, as well as among the middle classes. Can we find discourses that re-articulate a social consensus around ending hunger and poverty? And I'd just like to point out that is not a challenge that only Brazil faces. The UK has not found a social consensus or a discourse capable of acquiring broad social legitimacy around the unacceptability of millions of kids going to bed hungry every day in our country. And that's something that we hope the G20, which includes the UK, will address as a domestic policy challenge. And that's one of the themes of the T20 event that Lydia and Peter and others will be doing at the Brazilian embassy in June is to invite people who work on global hunger to be in dialogue with people who work on hunger in the UK and with Brazilian experts like Fábio Vera Soares from IPEA on hunger as a challenge for every country in the G20 as well as for the G20 as a collective within a multilateral system. And I think that is the broad concern of Brazil, is that the G20, which is a club, does not take away energy and resources from the multilateral system. Brazil has always, as Lai said, been very strong on the multilateral principle on strengthening the UN system. We have time. Obviously, some colleagues may need to leave, but we do have time, I think, to take a round of questions from people online. So, Gary, would you like to offer them the opportunity either to have you read the comments that have been made in the chat, or to have open up the microphone and speak? Yeah. Okay. Over to Gary.
This one's from Stephen Devereux. Given the high levels of food insecurity and hunger that Lula inherited, is his government planning to reintroduce a version of FOME Zero, FOME Zero, which is a program introduced by Lula in 2003 with the goal to eradicate hunger and extreme poverty? Okay, this one's from Issa 2-Star. What are some success stories or best practices that have emerged from Brazil's engagements in the fight against hunger, both bilaterally and within multilateral platforms like the G20? And finally, there's a couple of dual questions that link to each other. This is from Laura. So thank you for this. This is to Lydia. The issue of fragmentation bypassing existing multilateral is key. Could you expand a bit more on this? And a link question from Jennifer Constantine. Following on from Laura's question to Lydia, do you have an insight on how the UN food agencies feel about Brazil using the G20 to launch the Global Alliance? I know Brazil doesn't want to duplicate efforts, but rather focus attention on existing efforts. Nonetheless, it seems slightly at odds with past strategy.
Very good questions. Who wants to go first? Thank you, Gary. Volunteers to go first?
Well, thank you for the questions. Well, the first one about Fome Zero, zero hunger. I think this is the main problem. Like Lula and his government, they are rescuing just the old programs, and I think this thing that Lydia said about the lack of creativity and the need of new solutions to new challenges is something that is not being tackled like by the new government. I don't see like new initiatives, and I think that the problem is like that we are rescuing old initiatives, but we are not creating new ones. And this is not neither useful nor like tackle the problem of these kind of contradictions that we have that are bigger. And I feel that social movements and civil society in general, organized civil society, are not like tolerating it more, like this kind of this lack of creativity or the contradictions that we had before. Well, it's how I feel. And about positive experiences, yeah, we had many like good experiences, but also we have well, for what I've been studying about South Brazilian cooperation in agriculture and fighting against hunger, we also have a lack of proper evaluation of some programs. We have had some positive experiences from one point of view and not so positive in another. For example, the transference of the school meal programs is a very good example of good. We have good we have had good experiences with other countries, and the internationalization of Brazil as pivotal country in with the FAO cooperation, there is this specific program with Brazil, that is the FAO Brazil program. This is an important initiative, but we have also like the acquisition of machinery of Brazilian companies in Africa. That was a big failure. So we have had these great experiences from one side, and from the other, not so good experiences, and experiences that we need to evaluate better. That's it.
Great.
Yeah, just to add to that on that specific point, that okay, Lais mentioned several programs, and two things I would like to say on that. One is that even programs that seem to be have been very popular in Brazil and have been used for cooperation abroad become quite problematic in practice. If you study them then in detail, you realize that, you know, there are no silver bullets. You know, there are problems of in which the way they are translated to development cooperation projects. So just to say that we always have to take these successes with a pinch of salt. I think there's good experiences, but they have been they hadn't been perfect. So the other thing I wanted to say is that I said it when in my presentation, it's not just about going back to those programs. The world looks different. There's other things that Brazilian actors have been involved with, and we've been, some of us here at IDS, including Jenny and Alex, under the guidance of Alex, involved in a project of mapping grassroots innovations, including in the food, in addressing food insecurity. And one of the things that we've learned about these grassroots innovations that emerge in the context of the pandemic is that they're not easily scaled up. They're not easily turned into recipes that you can take elsewhere. That's something that we already knew about cooperation, but I think these grassroots experiences have a particular configuration where how they are embedded in local communities, how they are managed, sometimes in a little bit ad hoc way that makes them really suitable to address the needs of the people who they benefit. So these things are not easily scalable. So they're not very popular to put in recommendations to the G20, because you can't really design a big policy that draws on their very localized grassroots experiences. So that's a bit of a problem. Just to say another thing is that the interesting thing about when we look at food security responses by Brazilian government and other actors, I think one important thing that we see is the process of creating, designing, and implementing, and the dynamic interaction between government and civil society, local government, and so on. And this, so this is more not so much about the intervention, but about the process in which the intervention is designed and then it's implemented. This process elements are, again, not easily turned into a project because they're very context specific. So this is something that I think Brazilian cooperation hasn't really been able to incorporate very, very successfully, perhaps with one or two examples. It's this these experiences, these process elements of its domestic experience, the ways in which different actors interact, something that's not easily exportable. I wanted to just say, in response to Laura, and I think Jenny's point, perhaps I might need to hear Jenny's question again, but in relation to Laura's point, Brazil is part of multiple spaces. There's the BRICS, there's the G7, there's not the G7, the G20, the IPSA. There's multiple spaces of engagement. Its commitment to multilateralism, its strong support to multilateral organizations, as we've learned from LIS. But the thing is that in all these spaces, sometimes the message is a little bit different. The discussions within the BRICS center very much around infrastructure development. Some of the language, it's not aligned with the discussions that Brazilian delegation have at FAO in the context of the CFS and so on. So I think, I see the reasons, from a geopolitics point of view, why Brazil is a part of all these coalitions and other governments as well. But they do create a little bit of a problem in terms of the alignment between different priorities and contradictions. Just on perhaps on Stephen's point of whether Lula wants to reinstate Fama Zero. I think this is really what's happening, right? By giving emphasis to the role of the Ministry of Social Development, by making hunger and poverty as well as inequality the priority. This is already, it's the ideas that are around Fama Zero, the holistic responses that tackle different issues from those connected to food insecurity of children, to small-scale farmers' access to markets, and so on. That was all part of the Fama Zero framework. So I think we're back in that. The thing is that I think we need a Fama 0.2 or 2.0, another way of, because it's not the same thing. The context has changed, and our understanding of the problem has changed. By Brazilian experts has changed, and that needs new ideas. I think that's something that I'm hoping that the G20 will help mobilize. But watch this space.
Thank you, Lydia. I mean, I think, as I understood Jenny's question, she was curious as to how it looked from the other side. How does the UN system see Brazil's option for the G20 as a venue for launching this global alliance? And I mean, have you picked up any signals through your various contacts in Berlin or elsewhere, or is that kind of, we can guess what they're thinking, but we don't know?
Yeah, I think that's the answer. I think there's the concerns. There are the concerns that everyone has been talking about diluting the strength of existing spaces, and multilateralism is very important because it's the most representative club you have, the UN, I mean, you have in the world, with a strong commitment to sustainable development. So the Summit of the Future will be an important space. And I think the G20, or the process that is unfolding at the moment, it's a little bit a moment of rehearsing what the influence could be at the Summit of the Future. But it is important that it doesn't circumvent or dilute that space, because that's the most representative and legitimate space we have in global governance. And I think everyone is, a lot of people are very aware of that and very concerned.
Yeah, it's certainly a concern we hear very frequently, but it's also, of course, a dilemma Brazil is engaging with, because, as you pointed out, through the SDGs and so on, Brazilian diplomacy and Brazilian global influence flourished at a time of stronger multilateralism. We are in a time of critically endangered multilateralism and a UN system that that is struggling with multiple challenges, and where clubs of various kinds and minilateralism and unilateralism are gaining ground. So it's if Brazil throws all its weight behind the UN, it could make a vast contribution to the success of the Summit for the Future agenda, but it's also a risk for Brazil to be seen to be putting all its eggs in a basket whose viability is in question. So I think we don't underestimate the challenge that Brazilian diplomats, who are famously skilled at navigating these contradictions, face. But I think Brazil's G20 presidency has come at a particularly critical moment for the UN, as well as for various other challenges the world faces around climate and, of course, the fight against hunger. And I think that what Lais and Lydia have shown us is that these things, the contribution that Brazil brings to this is built on a foundation that is contradictory, problematic, but nonetheless remarkable and possibly unique in the world. And so actually, it is hard to think of a better venue for having these debates. We shouldn't expect a Brazilian miracle in the summit in November, but we should acknowledge the weight of experience as well as the depth of reflection on contradictions and problems that Brazil, inside and outside government, that its actors bring to this. And so I think this is a propitious moment for the world to have Brazil as a venue for engaging with these complex and challenging issues, and hopefully regaining some of the momentum and political and social energy that they need to be tackled. But thank you very much indeed again to the speakers. Thanks for excellent questions online and in the room. We will, yes, please sign up to the Brazil Group mailing list if you haven't already done so. We have at least one more seminar in the series coming. We're hoping to welcome Andrés de Sousa Santos from King's College London as well as a speaker in the series, from the King's Brazil Institute, and other exciting speakers, TBC. But for today, many thanks, and thanks particularly to Lays and Lydia, and of course, best wishes to Melissa, and get well soon.
Yeah.
Was that it for online questions, Gary? There's 2 more. Oh, there were. Yeah. We only had 2 more minutes, so but we didn't do the round.
How many people do we have online?